Good morning, wherever you may be. I'm sorry that I did not schedule this Facebook Live presentation, but what are you going to do? That's the way it is with Zoom and the kids and all that. I'd like to just jump right into this. Just a few days ago, before Shabbos, I became aware of a recording of a shiur given by Rabbi Yisrael Reisman, one of the Rosh Yeshiva in Torah Vodaas, concerning Tekhelet. I thought that the date on the video of the shiur, which is uploaded in a number of places, but also happens to be hosted at wanyutorah.org, was back in 2018 in June. It turns out it was 2011, and I thought it was worthy of a response. There's some points I wanted to make regarding it. I think that perhaps in since then there might have now been others who have already responded to what Rabbi Reisman had to say, counter arguments or rebuttals, etc. I do know, perhaps someone could correct me on this one. Sorry, as far as I know, Rav Belsky, who's about 20 years older than Rav Reisman, was an older colleague of Rabbi Reisman in Torah Vodaas, and who passed away just a few years ago, by the end became an avid supporter of the new Tekhelet and actually advocated people wearing it. He himself wore it. Perhaps someone could give real clarification, real edus regarding that. But Rabbi Reisman, at least 9 years ago, did not believe that that which they produce now in Mishor Adumim, the common psil Tekhelet made from Urus trunculus secretions, is actually Tekhelet. And he brought up a number of points that I thought to address. And then I discovered on the Psil Tekhelet's website that apparently Rabbi Aryeh Leibowitz, just shortly thereafter, back in 2011, gave a response. I think that there's what to add to what Rabbi Leibowitz said. I don't think he addressed every single point. I'd also like to disagree with both of them on a number of things. And let's get right into it. Just a few simple points. The Talmudic passage in Menachos Membeis Amud Beis is they're talking about te'ima of the Tekhelet. What happens there? You're supposed to take all the different ingredients, including the murex blood or whatever actual secretion it's supposed to be, assuming it's not, and you mix it up in water and you boil it, and that creates the dye. And then the Gemara talks about prior to using it to do the dyeing, it uses the verb te'ima, which literally means tasting. And I think that Rabbi Reisman was assuming that's what it does mean. He was talking about how it's not a problem of kashrus because one is only tasting it. Indeed, technically speaking, one could, even on fast days, taste food and not really swallow. But I believe, based on the way the Rambam has this sugya in the second parak of Hilchos Tzitzis, he's not talking literally about tasting. The Gemara is not even talking about tasting. It's borrowing the term. It's mean testing. It means to test the Tekhelet. One should not test the Tekhelet. One should not just dip in some strings or some wool and see if it comes out nice and blue. Rather, he has to pour off some into a separate vessel and do the testing with that, and then the rest of that test vessel, the contents need to be disposed of. I believe that's what the Gemara is talking about. Although now I'll make a joke. In modern Hebrew, there's no real difference between the two vowel sounds, so one could be forgiven for not distinguishing between test and test. Allah zecher zecher. In modern Hebrew, there's no real difference. We have a strong A sound, a long A sound, and a short E sound, the Tseirei and Sagol. But in modern Hebrew, it's all somewhere in between. So in this case, that could be forgiven. But that's what I legitimately believe that that is what the Gemara is talking about. It's not talking about tasting anything. Second point, Rabbi Leibowitz gave an answer. He said there was actually quite a good kasha that Rabbi Reisman had. Let's go into it. One of the supposed, and I believe one of the best proofs for the murex blood being the true Tekhelet is that it turns out if you do Rav Herzog's proposed recipe properly, you will get a molecular dye that is exactly the same as the final product when you do the same thing with indigo. And Chazal said that if someone wanted to rip people off and try to make a fast one on people who are trying to buy Tekhelet, so what he should do is just make indigo Tekhelet, dye the wool or the strings made out of wool using indigo, which is commonly used nowadays as the dye in blue jeans, and only God himself could tell the difference. And lo and behold, the reason now we know for that criterion, or sorry, the reason for that fact is that it turns out actual Tekhelet made is chemically identical to indigo. And Rav Reisman asked a very good question. If indeed in Mishnaic times they could already make a much cheaper version of Tekhelet, Tekhelet is expensive, and indigo is actually quite cheap, and even today it's even cheaper. Why would anybody, including the upper class and the royalty back in the day, even care to look for Murex Tekhelet or any other seed Tekhelet? They should just be using indigo and Shalom Al Yisrael. That'd be great. So it must be that the actual Tekhelet is very similar to indigo, but certainly not indigo, and distinguishable by other tests described in the Gemara. And the answer, Rabbi Leibowitz said, is that, it's because indigo showed up in the Jewish world relatively late in history. So what I have to add to that is, yes, that is actually true. It turns out indigo is what do you call it? It is named for India. It came from the East, and they only started using it. So in answer to Rev Reisman's question, I would say that originally in the Near East, in Egypt, and in ancient Israel, and even in Bavel, Babylonia, for centuries, including since the time of the Exodus, the only form of Tekhelet they had was snail Tekhelet, the stuff made along the coasts of the Mediterranean coast of the land of Israel by Tyrians and whoever else was in charge of the dyeing business. And it was only in Mishnaic times that indigo was brought in as a substitute. But the Jews still cared to strictly use Tekhelet because that is the mitzvah. The mitzvah is specifically to use Tekhelet and not to use a replacement dye. Now, this is along the lines of the classic inference made by many commentators, in the words of the Rambam, Maimonides, who seems to describe two types of Tekhelet. A very specific Tekhelet that is made from these snails and has a very specific process, and it has to be watered, it has to be tight, it has to be fast, it cannot come out in the laundry. And then there's the Tekhelet that they use for the priestly vestments in the temple. And he doesn't seem to really give many details about that, and he seems to imply, that the Tiferes pointed this out, Rav Kapach pointed this out, that only for tzitzis do we need the real deal, and imitations are acceptable in the temple. And Rabbi Rabinovich, as I've discussed before, actually showed that that is an incorrect inference. It's also not anything you could ever derive from the Gemara. Well, all that Rambam is saying is that Tekhelet for tzitzis has to last and has to survive your laundering, but not the Tekhelet for the priestly vestments, because those were never laundered. That's a halacha. The priest wore it until it needed laundering or until it became soiled, and then it was converted into other things. That's one of the highest standards they had in the temple. So the Jews, even when there was a perfectly legitimate, a perfectly equal in color substitute for Tekhelet, they still cared to use Tekhelet specifically, the animal kind, because that's what the Torah bid them to do so. And as for the upper class, this is something that Rav Herzog, this is actually one of the keys to Rav Herzog, that rediscovering the Tekhelet for us, was that throughout the Torah, Tekhelet is connected to Argaman. And as he discovered, the Murex trunculus is most likely, beyond, it would stand up in court, that the Murex trunculus is also the starting material for the Argaman, the Tyrian purple, when the kings used to wear robes and capes of royal purple, that's what they're talking about here. And that is basically made like Tekhelet, except indoors instead of outdoors. That's the distinction. So the royal class still cared about Tekhelet from Murex, even though they had indigo, because they were still making the Tyrian purple for quite some time from these snails, even if they were using Tekhelet less. And not only that, there's also, as been shown by a few chemists, you can get all sorts of different colors by combining different ratios, how much sunlight, how much darkness you use, and then even mixing them, you could get all the shades in between, from almost a red, not exactly red, for red they use crimson and some other things, but you get all sorts of shades along the purple to blue spectrum, even something, an aquamarine color, depending on how you produce this. So that's why they continued using Chazal, continued stressing that we should use the actual Tekhelet over the indigo, even though perhaps the indigo is exactly the same. And that's why people still cared. Next point, this is the third point, the nets thing. Rav Reisman points out that you could actually catch murex snails by walking into the sea near Akko and Haifa and places like that, and certainly in the Lebanese coast, and you could just pick up these snails right out of the ocean. As a matter of fact, when I was 18, my friends and I did that. We went to the place where they're doing this, and it was hanging on my friend's wall back in yeshiva, two tufts of wool. One died indoors and one died outdoors. The one indoors had a purple hue, and the one outdoors had a blue hue, and indeed you don't have to do that. But the Gemara assumes that you need nets to catch these things, or at least the nets were made on Shabbos. You would tie the rope. Well, you're not supposed to tie them on Shabbos, but tying nets is considered a forbidden malacha, forbidden labor on Shabbos, and it's because the people who are catching the Tekhelet use nets. So he says these murex shells, or the living ones, before they leave their shell, are so easy to catch. What do you even need nets for? And the answer is on also an experience I had younger. I've caught fish with a fishing line, and I've caught fish with nets. I've caught turtles with my bare hands, and I've caught turtles with nets. Many people can attest to this. Anybody who's been in Camp Yesharim knows this. They saw me do this many times. And one of the advantages of using a net is that you can do a lot more. Indeed, if you want to get a bunch of murex shells, murex snails still in the shell, you can go into the sea and in the shallow waters and start picking some out, and you'll get a handful of them, and you might be able to make a little bit of Tekhelet. But the people who are doing this on what was then a large scale, not industrial scale, this is before the Industrial Revolution, but the people, those Tyrians and Phoenicians who were trying to make large quantities of royal purple for a king's robe, or Tekhelet in order to supply those Jews who run the temple in Jerusalem, or just to sell to the Jewish people who are looking to make Tekhelet, you need to get a lot more. The reason they would use nets is because they would go farther out to sea where they could find a large bed of these snails and use a net in order to sweep up many at once. That's the difference between fishing with a line and fishing with a net. If you want to catch a fish for one meal, you use a fishing line. You make a day of it. And if you want to catch large quantities of tuna so that you can have a whole cannery, you need to use a net. So yes, you can catch one murex with your bare hands. It's barely even catching. It's very simple. But if you want to catch enough to make a business out of it, you have to use a net. And that's why they were using nets, and that's why Chazal assume that they were tying these nets, and that's why it's a malacha on Shabbos. Another is a little bit of the last point. It's a little bit of vocabulary here. We know of three bodies of water, and I'm going to use their English names in order to be very specific and unambiguous. The Mediterranean Sea is called the Mediterranean Sea, and it's not called that in our classic sources. It's either called just Yam HaGadol, sometimes Yam HaTichon, or Hayam, just the Yam. And it seems that a lot of times when Chazal refer to halachically what's considered Yam, seas, of course they're referring to the oceans and to the Mediterranean. So, for example, someone who has not seen the sea, at least for the last 30 days, would say the blessing upon seeing that. There's a blessing the sages institute upon seeing the sea for the first time in a long time. That would apply to any of the great seas that are connected to the world ocean, even if they're very much disconnected. So the Mediterranean is connected to the Atlantic Ocean by a small passage near Gibraltar. And the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, those would be seas also. The Baltic Sea, that's what Rav Soloveitchik saw for the first time. That's the sea. It might as well be the ocean. Even though you look on a globe, it's really small compared to the Atlantic Ocean or to the Indian Ocean. But for us, that's good enough. Then there is the Kinneret. The Kinneret, or the Sea of Galilee, is called Kinneret in the Torah. Yam Kinneret, etc. Or the sages called it Yam Ginosar. There's other names that also are in from other documents back then. And then there's what you and I call the Dead Sea. And in the Torah, that's called Yam HaMelach, which is literally the Salt Sea. Now, Rambam refers many times in his Perush to the Mishnayos and in the Mishnah Torah and in other writings to both Yam HaMelach and Yam hamavet, or in Arabic, yam il mayit. Notice that Rambam's word for the Dead Sea is actually similar to ours. We call it the Dead Sea, and in Arabic it was called basically the Dead Sea, Yam il Mayit. And when the Rambam refers to the seas, the oceans, and the Mediterranean, etc., he calls that Yam HaMelach. Why Yam HaMelach? Why the salty sea? Because it's salty compared to freshwater bodies of water like the Kinneret. So in the Rambam's term, when Rambam says Yam HaMelach, he's not referring to what we call in Hebrew Yam HaMelach. He's referring to just the sea. And if Rambam meant what you and I call Yam HaMelach, which is the Dead Sea, he'll actually be quite literal. He'll use the Hebrew term or the Arabic term that's actually Dead Sea. So the Rambam wasn't saying that the Murex trunculus or whatever can be found in the Dead Sea. He meant it could be found in the actual sea, not the Kinneret, which is freshwater, and certainly not in what you and I know as the Dead Sea, because there are no marine animals in the Dead Sea. There are no snails, there are no fish, there's nothing from which you can make a dye. Perhaps a mineral source. Maybe you could extract certain salts, etc., from the sea mud and other things around there and make some sort of blue dye, perhaps lapis lazuli. There's a whole thing in the Israel Museum about that, but that's not what he's talking about. So the Rambam is not incorrect on this point. The Rambam is telling you where to find these things. Why? The question is, why would Rambam do this? Why would he suddenly refer to these bodies of water instead of their classic Hebrew, Mishnaic, rabbinic names and use the more classical Arabic names? And the answer is very clear. The Rambam wrote in Arabic. And he even uses Arabic idiom a lot of times in Hebrew. That's the first, that's something that's pointed out right on at the beginning of his Mishnah Torah and in other places where he says yesh sham, there is, instead of just saying yesh. In English, you and I say there is. And like my father pointed out, what's the word there doing? There is there, sham. So even in English, we add this extra word pointing to some other place. That's also in Arabic. Fi means there, and they add that. It's the short fi. There's two fees in Arabic. That's not the point. In Arabic, you say the equivalent of yesh sham, or like in English, there is, instead of saying Hebrew yesh, is, or Aramaic, it, or icha, or similar words. One time, even Tanakh, there's even the word ish, without a yud, which is basically the equivalent of yesh, and that's also a little bit a dialectical variation of the same word. And that's all we have for tonight. Let's see, it's questions, comments. Ooh, I can't see any of the comments here. So if you have any questions or comments, don't forget like, share, and subscribe. Haggadah Pesach is still for sale. And if you like what you saw, tell me so we could do similar videos to this one next time. Have a good night, good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you are.